So the presentation that I'm about to give today, Hidden Resources, a study of the role of refugee return and peace building, it's a comparative study of refugees who have returned, Liberian refugees who have returned from Ghana and Guinea, and their role in the peace building processes that is currently ongoing in Liberia. So I seek to identify what resources that refugees or returnees, in the case of repatriation, bring along with them to their home country, and how that also influences or play a role in their contribution to the peace building process. So before I go on with the presentation, a quick note on where I am coming from and probably why I chose this area as my research for my PhD dissertation. As she rightly pointed out, for my BA, I did a research on the impact of refugees on the host community. And so it was this whole idea of looking at what is happening to the community that thousands and thousands of Liberian refugees are living in Ghana. And there's a lot of research on that aspect, the impact, both positive and negative. And so for my BA, I concluded that there was a mixed impact of both positive and negative. So however, as I did that research and subsequently reading, then I started questioning myself, what about the reverse? What kind of impact are these host communities making on the refugees? And so if every study is concentrating on the impact of refugees on the host community, what about the host community impacting these refugees? And to what extent are these impacts being reflected on the refugees? And so when you find out the impact of the host community on the refugees, then what? So then I started looking at it from the perspective of, then when they return, how does that affect them in rebuilding their own personal lives, as well as the community in which they return to. So I started reading around this whole question of the impact of the host community on refugees. Unfortunately, there is not much literature on that. Very few migration studies have looked at the impact of economic migrants on host communities' relationship to economic migrants and how that affects them, but not so much as to the impact of host communities on refugees, especially in the context of developing countries, and to be precise, in Africa, where we know millions of the world refugee population live. So it also led me to the question of how are we studying repatriation in refugee studies to begin with? Is repatriation a process on its own, or we look at repatriation as a process that is linked with the entire refugee experience? Once again, the literature points to a discussion of repatriation studies as being a process on its own. So the dominant view in repatriation studies is that it is durable or it is problematic. So you have two schools of thought in repatriation studies. And in both two schools of thought, there's this whole idea that repatriation process begins when the war has ended and you return the refugees to their home country, and it ends once they get off the buses, the boats, the aeroplane, and whatever means of transportation they arrived with. So there's this delinking of the whole process of repatriation from the refugee experience. So in delinking it from the refugee experience, what emerges out is this narrow discourse of repatriation, where we know very little of the life of the refugee, beginning from flight, living in asylum, returning, and even after returning. And secondly, it does not tell us much about how the host community has impacted the resources of these refugees. And so it's this lengthy process. Of course, it is difficult to follow refugees when they flee their home country, live in asylum, and not all of them return as a matter of fact. So they make decisions, they make choices. And so I decided that there's a need that we need to study refugee repatriation as in three phases. So you begin from flight, where you look at the resources that the refugees arrived with in asylum. And subsequently, you look at the conditions of asylum, how they impact these resources that they arrived with. And then, when they return to their home country, what is the home country doing to harness these resources? Is it a question of we don't know much about them, so the home countries cannot be bothered? Or is it a question of the whole peace building process and agenda, where there is no recognition of including refugees, returnees, sorry. So returnees are seen as, well, the war has ended, we brought them back home, or the cost of flight is no longer in existence, so they return. However, the reconstruction process, they are left out of the whole reconstruction process. So then I decided that when they bring the resources, what is it they are doing? So looking at peace building strategies as security, good governance, justice and reconciliation, and economic strategies, I look at these resources that returnees bring and how they contribute to these four main strategies of peace building. I'm not going to bore you much about about my methodology, the literature, among others. We can talk about that later, which I hope that we'll have a very insightful discussion on it. So I'm going to go. Sorry about that. I just want to skip this and just move on. So generally, my research argues that given a secured environment and conducive policy and program conditions in asylum and home, returnees are potential assets and not a challenge for peace building. So when they return with these assets, they can be an asset that the home country, so I tend to use host and home country. So the home country, meaning the country of return, can harness for the peace building process. So the two cases that I look at are returnees from returnees from Ghana and Guinea, so they are Liberian returnees. And so what you see there is just my conceptual framework. So in terms of that, and I said we need to look at the whole refugee experience. So beginning from flight conditions, so pre-asylum condition, asylum condition, and return conditions serve as the independent variable that in turn affects the intervening variable of the resource pool of the returnees. So within these three phases of the refugee experience, I'm looking at how each phase impacts their resources. And then once this has impacted their resources, how does that help them in their role in peace building? So we're going to start with the refugee experience and their resources. So the flight and the resources, the mode and duration in Guinea. Liberian refugees, and just a brief account of why Liberian refugees had to flee their home country into asylum. In 1989, a war began in Liberia, and it lasted for 14 years. So the literature discusses that the entire 3 million population of Liberia was displaced. Most of them were internally displaced. However, we have majority of them, some of them also fleeing into neighboring countries and the West African countries, including Guinea and Ghana, which are the focus of my discussion. So for the refugees who went to Guinea, most of them were from the northern sector of Liberia, and when the war came to their community, they fled by walking mainly to Guinea. So at the border of Guinea, you have Liberia and Guinea share border. So you had Liberians crossing over. According to the 30 returnees that I interviewed, on the average, most of them walked for periods between 8 hours to 12 hours from their communities. On the normal day today, they told me that it took about briefly 30 minutes or an hour to walk to cross over. But what happened was that because they were trying to avoid rebels attacking them, they went through the bush path, which meant that they had to stay in to make sure that they never came in contact with the rebels. So because some of them who came in contact with the rebels had the challenge of being made to work for the rebels, or you could either be killed or lose some resources. In terms of the reception at the Guinean border, some of the returnees noted that they had to part away with the little resources that they had. Like some of them had to pay their way to be allowed to enter Guinea, and subsequently the few resources that they were able to carry along with, they lost them at the border as well. Some were even detained and harassed because the Guinean officials told them they were suspected to be rebels, so they needed to screen them before they would be allowed to enter. In the case of refugees who arrived in Ghana, among all the 30 returnees that I interviewed in Liberia, majority of them arrived in Ghana on board the Ghana Navy and Army ships. So Ghana, as part of trying to help Liberia with the war, had deployed soldiers to go and help the Liberian government. So when these ships were returning to Ghana, at the port in Monrovia, Ghana decided to repatriate its nationals. Unfortunately, at that time, what happened was that the military officers could not decide who was a Ghanaian and who was a Liberian. So the first batch of Liberian refugees that arrived in Ghana, it was not Ghana's intention to bring in Liberian refugees, but they happened to do, when they arrived, Ghana realized that indeed they had rather brought in thousands and thousands of Liberian refugees, which they thought they were Ghanaians. And so for the first time, Ghana had to deal with the situation of having all these numbers of people which they had never prepared to receive. Because the intention was that if they were Ghanaians, once they arrived, you fed them the line and then they will all return to their home community. So Ghana had to put in measures. Subsequently, it became the military's policy that whenever they were returning, if there were any refugees at the port, the Monrovia port, they would bring them along as well. So this, and then you had some also arriving by the Air Force helicopters that were sent in. So some scholars have described the arrival of Liberian refugees in Ghana as accidental. It was never meant to be. However, credit is always given to Ghana for standing up to the situation and helping them subsequently and also welcoming them. So most of them also, before they even arrived in the Monrovian port, had traveled far and wide from other parts of Liberia. So unlike the case of refugees who went to Guinea, where there was this, it was a group of people from the same social cultural background who went to Guinea. Those who went to Ghana were coming from various cultural backgrounds from Liberia. So you had people who had traveled, who had walked around Liberia for like 3 months before they arrived at the port, where they were subsequently brought to Ghana. So you had a lot of them arriving in Ghana in very terrible health conditions. The trip to Guinea might have been exhausting, but most of the returnees said when they arrived in Guinea, they were healthy. So comparing that, you had very you had returnees in Ghana were faced with health conditions that were linked with the periods that they had to travel around Liberia, and also the conditions on those ships were not the best. Those ships were meant to carry military personnel and also equipment from the military, so they were not the best conditions for these people. So asylum experience. I've explained the arrival and reception. In terms of settlement, you had most of refugees in Guinea living among, they did not set up camps in the first time when they arrived. So you had them living among host communities. Individuals offered their homes to the refugees, and subsequently the Guinean government set up camps for them. But you had most of them living in the rural community, and some of them said that their camps were located at the periphery of the rural community. So it was not in the center of the community. It was pushed to the far end of the community, which also limited their contact with the host community as well. In the case of Ghana, Ghana did not have any refugee camps, and the ships arrived in Tema, which is very close to the capital city. So Ghana had no option than to look for a place that was very close. So they were located about 20 kilometers from Accra, which is the capital city, so, and in the community itself. So the refugees consistently had contact with them. The camps were not enclosed. They could travel in and out of the camps anytime, and some of them had the option of having an address in the camp and also living outside the camp for the benefit of attaining government and UNHCR aid. In terms of refugee laws, both countries never had any refugee laws when the refugees arrived. In the case of Ghana, Ghana didn't have any refugee law. It took Ghana 2 years before it established its refugee law. So in terms of granting status and other rights to the refugees, both countries relied on the African Organization of African Unity refugee laws, and argued that because of the war in Liberia, all Liberians who found themselves in Ghana and Guinea qualified to be refugees. And so in the case of Guinea as well, it took Guinea more than 2 years before it established its first substantive refugee policy to guide its principles for this. The non-existence of these refugee laws meant that all these refugees were based on prima facie case, where they were not based on individual status. And so the side effect of that was that when refugees applied for resettlement, for instance, they had to go through another process of retelling their story and how they feel that they were affected by the war. So you had a lot of challenges for the refugees. Secondly, there was a challenge in Guinea with respect to giving refugee documents, as carrying a document that indicates your refugee status. It was also a challenge in Ghana. However, Ghana was able to overcome it because it allowed the UNHCR to provide the refugees with those documents, while Guinea refused it. In terms of refugee aid, in both countries, education and skills training and healthcare was primarily the responsibility of the UNHCR and other NGOs. So it was not part of the government policies, although each country's refugee laws and policy indicates that refugees have a right to education, healthcare, settlement, among others. It became the UNHCR that provided these. And my research focuses especially on the provision of education and skills training as an area to evaluate how these the resource levels of the returnees. And so in both countries, relegating this responsibility to the UNHCR, the side effect of that was that you had refugees in Ghana attaining higher levels of education compared to UNHCR, mainly because in Ghana, the environment was conducive. You had a lot of international organizations coming in to help the UNHCR provide them. In the case of Guinea, where security was the main issue, not necessarily because of the presence of the refugees, but because Guinea had its own internal security challenges that it has been dealing with. And also the regime in Guinea was one that the international community frowned upon, and so there was not this rush to go to Guinea's aid to help Guinea with the Liberian refugees, unlike the case of Ghana that had established itself in terms of moving from authoritarian regime to a democratic regime, and the refugees were also beneficiaries of this process of Ghana trying to establish itself as what they call the black star on the continent. In terms of refugee survival strategies, both countries had high unemployment rates, so it meant that even refugees who had the skills did not have the opportunity to get employment in the formal sector. So among all the 60 returnees that I interviewed, only 3 returnees from Ghana indicated that while in asylum they had worked in the formal sector. Majority of them worked in the informal sector. those in Guinea worked as they had access to land given to them by individual host communities, which they use for farming. Some of them also work as contract laborers on Guinean farms. And in Ghana, majority of the refugees work in informal sector, mainly in construction, in trading, and also a development that was associated with the presence of the refugees that was working in communication sector. So you had a lot of emerging internet facilities in these refugee camps that most of the refugees established themselves and were also working in. You had some of them also who were employed by the various NGOs that came to work in the refugee camps. So these were some of the benefits that the refugees in Ghana gained, while those in Guinea did not benefit from. So having explained the asylum experience, I move on to repatriation and the returnees' resources. Can you please pass these on? So in terms of repatriation, it is generally known that there are two types of repatriation, assisted and self-return. The literature focuses much on assisted repatriation, and there's been this argument that in terms of assisted repatriation, you don't need, the refugee is not an active actor in the decision-making process, because the decision is made for the refugee by three main actors, which are the UNHCR, the governments of the asylum country, and the home country as well. So what happens is that the refugee is perceived as just reacting to the decision made by these three main actors. And the argument is that it's because the refugees lack certain levels of capabilities. In the self-return exercise, it is acknowledged that since the refugee is the only one that makes the decision, that is the form of repatriation that the refugee is involved in making that. However, I argue that in both forms of repatriation, the refugee is an active participant, and in both forms, you also need the consent of the refugee in order for them to repatriate. So whether the three actors make this decision without involving the refugee experience or the refugee's agents comes to play. And in both cases, we see that various forms of agencies were adopted by the refugees to enable them to participate in both the self and assisted repatriation methods. So in Guinea, both repatriation means occurred. We had self and assisted. Among the 30 returnees, 11 of them indicated that they self-repatriated. And what that meant was that they could not be guaranteed security in the home community, and secondly, they could also not benefit from the retaining aid from the UNHCR. When I asked them why they chose that option, especially when they knew the consequences of it, majority of them indicated that they had to come to prepare a place for their family. And so, and secondly, if security was an issue in their home country, they could not guarantee their security either in Guinea, because after 2001, security for the refugees had become a major problem in Guinea. So by 2003, when the refugees decided that they needed to return, they were looking at the security challenges in Guinea and how that compares to their home country. So they made that decision based on knowing the consequences of it. In terms of aid package, they were also aware that although as family heads, and I must point out, all these 11 returnees were male. Although they were not going to receive the individual returnee package, they were also well aware of the fact that they could, their families could benefit from the returnee package. So the refugees made these decisions of returning, knowing the information of the asylum country, and also knowing what was happening in their home country. And then they look at their resources, to what are the benefits for them in terms of returning. Some of them also said that they they chose to self-return even at a time when the UNHCR repatriation exercise had begun, because they did not, the UNHCR procedure of indicating the time for the convoys to arrive, and also who and what to carry along with them, did not take into consideration their situation. For instance, some of them said that at the time that the convoys were leaving, they had their farms, they were yet to harvest their crops, and so they were not going to leave behind those crops and join a convoy just to lose on that. And so they made some of these decisions. They are looking at their resources and how repatriation also affects their resources. In terms of the aid, subsequently, when they returned, they demanded that they should have, they should also receive the aid, and that their decision to return on their own should not preclude them from accessing the retaining aid. So the UNHCR had to change its policy. So you find a situation where these retainees, they might not lack similar capabilities as these three main actors, but they were able to change some of these policy directions. So the UNHCR changed its policy on not assisting self-retainees and also giving them aid. But the caveat there was that they had to return their refugee document. And as one retainee noted to me, how do I return something that I was never given? As I've indicated to you, in Guinea, most of them did not have their refugee IDs, and so if the UNHCR uses that as a caveat for them to benefit from the aid package, it meant that they were not going to receive it. Subsequently, they also benefited from community aid packages such as access to education, healthcare institutions, among others. So they might not have benefited from the individual aid packages, but they have since benefited from that. In terms of Ghana, you had all the 30 returnees that I interviewed, only one of them self-returned, and the decision to join the assisted repatriation exercise from Ghana, according to most of these returnees, was based primarily on the cost of self-returning, because Ghana does not share a boundary with Guinea, and also at the time of the repatriation exercise, Cote d'Ivoire was engaged in a civil war, so you could not travel by road to Liberia, and it meant that you had to travel by air, which was more expensive. So they looked at the cost of traveling to Liberia by themselves, which meant that they would lose some material resources, so they decided why not join the repatriation exercise. Secondly, also in the decision to join the repatriation exercise in Ghana, the refugees challenged the UNHCR in terms of the aid package that was given to them. The UNHCR had decided it was going to give each retainee $5 US upon return. However, the refugees from Ghana demanded that that was not enough, and that $5 did not cut it for them. And so they were able to change it, and retainees from Ghana received $100. Even the $100 US, they subsequently demonstrated, they protested into UNHCR Geneva, and then there were demonstrations in Ghana, which the government of Ghana responded in a very negative way to this protesters who were arrested, and about 13 of them were deported as being illegal in Ghana. What these returnees did was once again change the repatriation policy. Returnees from Ghana were also able to change even the duration. It was between the three actors. It was decided that repatriation was going to begin in 2004 and end in 2007. However, repatriation from Ghana continued into 2009 because the refugees demanded to have certain packages be met before they returned. So they were able to change the policy directions as well in terms of these repatriation exercises from Ghana. So when we look at the figures of repatriation numbers from Ghana and Guinea since 2003 to 2009, Obviously, it points to more returnees from Guinea as compared to Ghana. And so the literature on the repatriation exercise of Liberian refugees has generally classified repatriation from Guinea to Liberia as being more successful than from Ghana to Liberia. However, I contest that in looking at it from the perspective of just numbers, it's not the best way to look at whether repatriation exercise is successful or not successful, because repatriation itself is complex, and so looking at just numbers does not tell us, as for instance, the refugee agencies in determining the policies of repatriation that I've described to you, and also the resources that they bring along, and subsequently how they integrate in their home communities by building their own lives and the communities as well. So what you have in front of you, so for page 1 are the material resources, trying to look at what the returnees brought along to their home country. So you can look at the variations among them. It's not the best of graphic presentation of it, but when you look at it, generally you see more resources on the part of returnees from Ghana as compared to those from Guinea. You also have the social, the cultural, and the personal resources. So we can subsequently talk about the variations in this. So what does this mean, having brought in resources? And I'd like to make a quick comment that in terms of the variations, when you look at it, as I indicated earlier on, Ghana had more conducive environment compared to Guinea, and so there were more losses on the part of refugees from Guinea. However, when you look at that, the refugees who came from Guinea did not come back to Liberia empty-handed. They had all forms of resources, which in actual fact is also helping them to rebuild their lives. So in terms of the material and cultural resources, I look at how these resources are being used to rebuild the economy. So you have remittances from families and friends. Refugees continue to receive remittances from families and friends. Continue to receive remittances from families and friends, and this has gone a long way to help the Liberian economy. Ghana benefited tremendously from the presence of Liberian refugees in terms of remittances from these refugees. So you have numbers of people who indicated that as part of even the repatriation exercises, they received money from friends and family living abroad. Some of them drew upon their savings from asylum and have since repatriated those savings to Liberia. And also in terms of employment, you have most of these refugees being employed as teachers, nurses, bureaucrats, construction, agriculture, and entrepreneurs. In terms of the personal resources, I look at it towards security. During the signing of the peace agreement and the disarmament program, what came to light during my interview was that refugees, even while in asylum, played a role in the peace agreement. For instance, refugees in Ghana, the peace agreement for ending the war in Liberia in 2003 was signed in Ghana. And so for the whole month that these rebels were trying to negotiate the peace agreement in Ghana, you have some of these refugees who were always demanding that peace be returned to Liberia. So you got some of them camping at the various places that the rebels were living in Accra for the 1 month. Two of the returnees also, they had to sign, when they demanded a peace, they had, as part of the peace agreement, 2 of the returnees noted that they were present. However, since most of the returnees from Ghana started arriving in 2004, with some of the returnees from Guinea arriving as early as in 2003, in terms of the disarmament program, 2 of the returnees from Guinea indicated that they had been part of the disarmament program, going around. They volunteered for United Nations mission in Liberia, as part of the process, is trying to identify where all these arms are. So that has been their role. Also, their presence in the community indicate whenever peace building is going on, states tend to focus on the capital city and leave the periphery. So the presence of these returnees, for instance, those from Guinea, who are living in the northern part, in these rural communities, demand that the state's presence be felt in these communities. So otherwise, the state will not have made itself present. We have also NGOs who had to establish themselves in these communities. So the presence of these returnees has enhanced the state presence in terms of providing security to these communities as well. Secondly, some of them work in the security sectors. Unfortunately, only 2 of the returnees that I interviewed from Ghana noted that they work in this sector. One of them is a police officer and another one works as a border agent. And finally, in terms of security, I found out that most of these returnees volunteer as members of neighborhood watch programs, which they indicated that it's part of the process. As during asylum period, neighborhood watch programs became one of the UNHCR activities of trying to provide security for these refugees in asylum. So they tend to duplicate this in their various communities. Since the state is unable to provide security for them, they tend to organize themselves into these programs, which you do not find in Monrovia. However, in the northern part of Liberia, where most of the returnees from Guinea are engaged in. You also have some of the returnees volunteering or even working for NGOs that are working in peace building education. So most of these returnees, as you see, they benefited from the peace building education seminars that were organized in asylum. And having returned, they have become a source for some of these NGOs and even the state to use to educate the refugees in terms of enjoying peace in their home countries. Some of them indicate they are volunteers as facilitators of the peace building education. In terms of social resources towards governance, you also have the electoral participation of these returnees. Most of the returnees from Guinea came in earlier, and so they were able to cast their vote during the 2005 election in Liberia. Some of them also joined in the campaign for most of the political parties. Some of them also have created NGOs. They volunteer or work with some of these NGOs. In the media, they indicated their participation in the media and also noted that it's their way of trying to make their government accountable to them. And so in a country that was known to have more than 100 years of politics of exclusion and abuse of human rights, with these returnees demanding for accountable government from their returnees, from their government and officials. For me, it served as a contribution to building peace in Liberia that will go a long way. Some of them have also established radio stations. You had one returnee from Ghana that has established a radio station and is also using that avenue to train journalists in Monrovia. As transmitters of ideas for social and political development, what came up during my interview was this whole idea of saving for the future. Most returnees from Ghana noted that prior to living in asylum, they never had this notion of saving for the future, which was quite interesting to me. It's something that they refer to as being a cultural thing in Liberia, where majority of them were used to, you make your money, you spend it today, knowing very well that in the future you probably might go to America. However, having lived in asylum and noticed that that opportunity does not exist for most of them, and recognizing that most Ghanaians were used to this whole idea of saving. And I must point out that when the Liberian refugees were in Ghana, that was the time that Ghana was trying to build its democratic rule, and also as part of trying to rebuild its own economy, the government had embarked on trying to enlighten Ghanaians on the need to save and also help the economy as well. So some of these returnees picked up on this idea. Some of them noted the idea of being patriotic and also responsible citizens. As one returnee from Guinea noted, indeed, if they had been patriotic, they probably would never have fought to destroy their country. And so, having lived in Guinea and realized that with a strong state in Guinea, which of course is something that needs to be looked at in terms of the returnees' whole idea of what a strong state is, they noticed that Guineans love their country because what is happening in Guinea has never exploded into conflict. However, Guinea has always had this authoritarian regime, there's been a lot of abuses, but they noted that because Guineans are more patriotic, which of course it's their own explanation of what is happening in Guinea, we can contest that. But with this sense of responsibility as citizens coming from these returnees, I think it's an idea that the Liberian government can harness as part of its own program of trying to educate Liberians on the needs to be more responsible. And I must point out that one of the returnees also noted that if war ever happens again in Liberia, they don't think there will be room for them in any of the West African countries because, as they noted, even Ghana is fed up with having them. So returnees' identity and interest towards justice and reconciliation, their participation in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission began even during when they were in asylum. So you had some of the returnees who had petitioned the TRC, and ever since they returned, they continue to participate in the process, which is part of the whole peace-building process that is ongoing. You also have, in terms of their relationship with the stayees in their home country, there's a lot of literature on how there is always some sort of friction between refugee returnees and the stayee community, because there's always this idea that some of them had fled when the country needed them, they stayed in, and then subsequently when they returned, they had received aid. But in the case of Liberia, what I found out was that the same aid package, and as I indicated earlier, the entire population was displaced. And so after the war, the government had to see to it that all these both internally displaced population were also returned. And so they received the same package as the returnees from asylum countries. And in terms of restitution of property, returnees from Guinea have not had this challenge because some of them even arrived in their community before those who were internally displaced arrived. And those who whose property had already been taken over by stayees indicated that when they arrived, they negotiated with them, and so there was no need for them to resort to other means of demanding for their property. However, in the case of returnees from Ghana, they came in quite late, and so they are still trying to negotiate for their property to be returned to them. Unfortunately, the government of Liberia has yet to establish a law on the return of property to these people. So it has been left in the hands of the returnees to negotiate for their property to be returned to them. So in concluding, I'd like to state that in the case of returnees from Ghana and Guinea, and to a larger extent from Africa, the level of their resources depends mainly on the security and governance situation of the host country. So for instance, because there were a lot of security challenges in Guinea, you had very low participation of the international community helping these refugees while in asylum as compared to those from Ghana. There were higher numbers of refugees in Guinea done in Ghana, but there's a whole lot of humanitarian activities from the international community. And when you look at the contributions of these countries, it points to the, as I noted, most of the aid came from the UNHCR and its donor communities, and not necessarily from the government. So the responsibility of the host countries is to provide a secure environment and also ensure that it's in the good book of the international community by having a very good governance structure. That way, more NGOs and the international community would also contribute to it.